But we begin with new information at the heart of the impeachment investigation into President Trump.
It is a part of an extensive piece, as we all well know, by the New York Times on this nearly $400 million in military aid that was withheld from Ukraine as Democrats are pushing for witnesses at the Senate trial. The Times reporting that during an Oval Office meeting, guys, back in late August, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Defense Secretary Mark Esper, and then National Security Advisor John Bolton tried but failed to convince the president to release this aid. The Times cites in part interviews with dozens of current and former administration officials, congressional aides, and others, as well as previously undisclosed emails and documents. The report also lays out the battle within the administration, naming acting chief of staff Mick Mulvaney as a, quote, key conduit for transmitting the president's demands for this freeze. As the National Security Council, Pentagon, and the State Department are pushing back, the Times reports that lawyers with the White House Budget Office, they actually developed an argument that the president's role as commander-in-chief would, quote, simply allow him to override Congress on the issue. As we now know, the president did not release the aid until September 11th after learning about the whistleblower report. And Elise, it is astounding to me considering the timeline of this whole thing. And then late August, you have John Bolton, you have Mark Esper, you have Mike Pompeo sitting down with the president, pleading with him to release this aid. And then 2 weeks later, it seems timeline-wise, that aid was finally released. But the president pushing back and saying, no, I'm not releasing it.
What's so amazing about this deep dive, and it puts into context a lot of the prior reporting and just gives you the timeline and the narrative, is just how politicized the process was within the Office of Management and Budget, which usually is a very functional, apolitical department that is enacting the president's agenda and congressional approved funding. And you look at how Mick Mulvaney, the acting chief of staff and former head of OMB, he allowed Donald Trump to speak with Rudy Giuliani alone because he didn't want to get involved and have attorney-client privilege overturned. And that just is amazing to me, that a national security issue, that American taxpayer dollars, that it wasn't about the chief of staff playing his role in executing the funding. It was about Donald Trump being ensured attorney-client privilege. And that's just so striking to me. I mean, can you ever think of an instance where funding for a foreign policy initiative has been so politicized?
Well, this is what happens when you staff your administration with people who are ultimately political and see politics and being of service to President Trump and Trumpism above all else. So Mick Mulvaney, as we know, was a Tea Party member of Congress, right? He was a pretty hard right, hard line conservative. And he came into the Office of Management and Budget basically running an organization that is supposed to fund the rest of the U.S. government, having run his political career on cutting as much from government as possible. So, you know, I do think it's interesting, though, that once again, you have people around Trump, as we saw with the Mueller report, who were at the very highest levels, telling him either no,
yeah,
or failing to follow through with his orders, which is interesting because however few guardrails still exist around this president, at least in this instance, it appears that there were some telling him enough.
And one of the more striking things about this story is that the president had executive branch lawyers, Dave Ignatius, working on a theory that he could override congressional funding simply because he was the president, which seems to, of course, thwart the whole system of checks and balances which this government is rested upon. What was your takeaway?
My takeaway, Jonathan, was similar to yours. This, I think, takes us back to the very heart of what the Ukraine scandal is about. We recall the July 25 phone call in which the new president of Ukraine, Zelensky, asks for renewal of U.S. military support. They're fighting Russian proxies on their border, and Trump says, yeah, I want a favor, though, and introduces this request for what would amount to political assistance in his campaign. The aid that Trump was making conditional had been voted by Congress. It had broad bipartisan support. It was something that the Trump administration had done, we should note, changing the policies of the Obama administration. And here's a top group. The following month, the phone call takes place in July, and then in August you have Mike Pompeo, pretty hard line, trying to toe the line, trying to be a presidential guy, joining with the new Defense Secretary, Mark Esper, somebody who's very close to Pompeo, and John Bolton, who's getting increasingly unhappy about what he's seeing swirling around this Ukraine issue, going to the president saying, sir, we need to stop that. We need to get this military aid moving again. This is a key national priority. And it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen for some weeks later, and the evidence is it doesn't happen until it's about to blow because of the whistleblower complaint. So I think it's useful in focusing our minds on just how insistent was this demand. He's the president. Doesn't matter if Congress voted it. He's the commander-in-chief, and he can overrule it against the strong criticism from his national security team. Mr. President, don't do that.
And picking up on that, on David's thought there, Eddie, I mean, the story is remarkable in its reconstruction of these events that led to this moment. And we know that since the moment she became Speaker, Nancy Pelosi really didn't want to go down the path of impeachment and sort of felt like her hand was forced. And by reading this piece, this reconstruction of what happened, don't you think that she didn't have a choice here, right? She had to take this step.
Absolutely not. She didn't have a choice. And it seems to me that what's clear in the New York Times piece is that Trump does not want these folk to testify, because they will in some ways reveal that there was some wrongdoing at the heart of this. And so I think it's really important, as I read the piece, to really think about the importance of subpoenaing, the subpoenas of Mulvaney, of Bolton, of Pompeo. We got to get these folks, right, under oath, talking about that meeting. And it seems to me that this gives even more justification, or provides more justification for Nancy Pelosi to not send the articles over to the Senate unless we get these folks under oath and testify.
Right. It comes as the contours of this trial are being worked out, and obviously Senate Majority Leader McConnell and Senate Minority Leader Schumer have yet to come to much of an agreement as to what's going forward.
Yeah.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.